and residents are joining us today. And I do want to start with some introductions just to level set. You are joining one session of an entire 2-week health policy elective dedicated to really informing medical students, future physicians, other allied health professional trainees and professionals in what our healthcare landscape entails and includes. I want to make sure that we all know who our panelists are, and so I'm going to take some time to read bios before we get started. This is a panel discussion, not just a didactic lecture. And so if you have questions at any point in this chat, if a specific remark brings up an emotion or a thought for you, if you really wanted to know a little bit more about any one of our panelists, if you have anything that you want to pose to our panel today, I want to encourage you to do so. My name is Kelly Butler. I'm a 4th-year medical student here at UCI, and I'm joined by Reese. Want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm Reese, also 4th year going into family, just like Kelly.
Yeah, so we will be moderating chat box, moderating this panel. So let's get into it, yeah? So I want to first introduce Dr. Diana Ramos. Dr. Diana Ramos is the chair for the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, California and Ecuador District. She is a well-recognized public health opinion leader, adjunct assistant professor at the Keck University of Southern California School of Medicine, and bilingual health media spokesperson. Previously, she was the LA County Public Health Department's Director for Reproductive Health. She is secretary for the National Hispanic Medical Association and immediate past president of the Orange County Medical Association, so our county's medical association, and is co-chair for the WPSI, or Women's Preventive Services Initiative Dissemination and Implementation Steering Committee. She serves on many national and international women's health improvement and equity committees. Her areas of expertise include health disparities, social determinants of health, preconception/interconception health, preterm birth, contraception, and quality improvement in health. She has written and contributed numerous articles to the obstetrics and gynecology and public health literature, and has lectured in Spanish and English, bienvenidos, locally, nationally, and internationally. She has received numerous innovation awards for her work in health, technology, and communication. She is founder of Gamify Health. Am I pronouncing that right, Dr. Ramos?
Yes, Gamify Health.
Gamify Health, a startup where health education and gaming are incorporated. She also has been a frequent awardee, has been really active in the digital health space, especially around gaming. She's won a series of awards that I'm going to leave you all with a little bit later. In terms of education, she received her medical degree from the University of Southern California with honors and completed her residency training in obstetrics and gynecology at LA County University at Southern California Medical Center. She received her MBA from the UCI Paul Merage School of Business with an emphasis in entrepreneurship and innovation, and her master's in public health from the University of California, Los Angeles. She completed her undergraduate degree, a BA in communications, arts and sciences from the University of Southern California. Welcome, Dr. Ramos. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Valencia P. Walker. She recently joined Nationwide Children's Hospital as Associate Chief Diversity and Health Equity Officer and an Associate Division Chief in Health Equity and Inclusion for the Division of Neonatology. Prior to her new role, she served as Assistant Dean of Equity and Diversity Inclusion for the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. A practicing neonatologist and physician advocate, she champions the elimination of maternal and infant health inequities. Dr. Walker holds several national and state leadership positions. Recently, she was elected to the Executive Committee of the American Academy of Pediatrics section on minority health equity and inclusion, in addition to her current position as program chair for the section. She also chairs the California Medical Association's Council on Legislation and provides guidance for the legislative activities of the nearly 50,000 members represented by the organization. Previously, she served as president for the Association of Black Women Physicians, of which I am a member, a nonprofit organization dedicated to diversifying the physician workforce, advocating for under-resourced communities, and promoting health equity. Dr. Walker completed her undergraduate studies at Florida A&M University and received her medical degree from Emory University School of Medicine. She finished a pediatric residency at UT Memphis and a neonatology fellowship at Cincinnati Children's Medical Center. She also obtained an MPH in health policy from Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Welcome, Dr. Walker. Next, I want to introduce Sarah Mae Smith. She's an MD PhD student at UC Irvine School of Medicine within the Medical Scientist Training Program. She began her involvement in organized medicine as an MS1, and I'm not going to ruin all the details because that's one of the questions that I really want her to dive into today. She currently serves on the CMA Board of Trustees and recently completed a term on the AMA Board of Trustees. She has also served on the AMA Council of Medical Service, chairing the Council's Committee on Health System Reform, as well as in numerous positions within the medical student section of the AMA, including MSS delegate on the governing council. Within the CMA, the California Medical Association, she has prior service on the CMA Council on Medical Services, the CalPAC Board of Directors, which is their lobbying and financial arm, if you will, the CMA Council on Legislation, and the CMA Council on Ethical, Legal, and Judicial Affairs. She currently lives in Anaheim and enjoys spending time with her 3 cats and pug, all rescues, when she is not studying or working on health policy. She's passionate about supporting and furthering the CMA's work to pursue health equity and justice, address social determinants of health, and expand access to health insurance in the pursuit of universal coverage. Welcome, Sarah Mae Smith. And last but not least, I want to welcome Dr. Anna Yap. She's a 3rd-year resident at the University of California, Los Angeles, All of You Emergency Medicine program. She obtained her MD from Loma Linda University School of Medicine and her dual BA in Integrative Biology and in Music from the University of California, Berkeley. A typhoon of passion, she uses her multidisciplinary background to advocate for patients and physicians since day one of medical school, striving for safer and more equitable healthcare system that cares for the most vulnerable of individuals. Most recently, she's been working to improve resident working conditions, engaging and supporting residents through her multiple leadership positions in organized medicine on the local, state, and national scale. She currently serves as Senior Digital Fellow at the American Medical Association, on the Governing Council of the California Medical Association Resident and Fellow Section, the Los Angeles County Medical Society Board of Directors, and the leadership team of #ThisIsOurShot campaign. Go get vaccinated. She recently completed her terms on the American Medical Association Resident and Fellows Governing Council, Committee of Interns and Residents, or CIR, Board of Directors, California ASAP Board of Directors, and continues to stay actively involved in these organizations. In her quote unquote free time, she enjoys exploring farmers markets, improvised cooking, gaming, and absolutely not getting out of bed. Amen, Dr. Yap. So I hope that we all understand that there is a diverse and wide array of expertise in organized medicine here. And I'm really excited about this panel. I'm like nerding out a little bit because all of you are my heroes in different respects. My first question for everyone, and that's why I didn't want to give the spoiler, Sarah, and so maybe we can start with you, is what was your first entry into organized medicine? Or what was your first memory of organized medicine?
Thank you, Kelly, so much for hosting the panel and putting this all together. It's a real honor to serve with Drs. Ramos, Walker, and Yap as well here. My first experience with organized medicine was here at UCI as a first-year medical student. Actually, one of the major incentives for me getting involved was that back in the before times, we would travel to AMA meetings. I'm from the East Coast. My first year medical school, I was fairly homesick, and the AMA meeting that year was in National Harbor back on the East Coast. I had done my undergrad in Baltimore, so I was looking for a all expenses paid trip to go back east. However, when I got to the meeting, I was blown away by the depth and breadth of expertise of everyone there and their passion for really making healthcare better. And I was able to connect with some folks at that meeting who had been involved with an organization I had been involved with during undergrad, Health Leads, that was really focused around addressing social determinants of health, and tried to support a resolution that some of the elder folks had brought at that meeting around addressing these social determinants of health. And unfortunately, that resolution did not pass. But the next meeting, still as an MS1, I came back with working with them and other allies to work on a resolution around supporting housing first approaches to homelessness. And that was really one of my first forays into organized medicine, was trying to solidify support for these approaches that offer housing to patients experiencing homelessness without any preconditions, and just supportive housing for as long as is needed. And eventually we were able to get that position adopted both by the American Medical Association and then by the California Medical Association as well. So that was my first experience.
Fantastic. And I think it's really important for us to understand that sometimes you're called to this. It's not some aha, absolutely, I know exactly what I'm doing when you're first year. Sometimes you're just called based on the issue. I do see your question here, Dr. Down. So I'd like to actually address that in our next question to all of our panelists to hear their perspectives. But first, I do want to come to you next, Anna. What was your first memory of entering the space around organized medicine?
So I went into medical school knowing that I was going to want to do something around health policy, probably having done work in the Navajo Nation and really seeing the health inequities there and realizing that like structural injustice is really going to be what we have to fix in order to really change things. So I went to Loma Linda, it's a Christian med school, and wasn't really sure how I was going to be able to do advocacy there. And similar to Sarah, I heard about this, like you can run for this position and it's like all inclusive paid trip to go do health policy stuff, and it sounded awesome. We are lucky to be in a state where the CMA, California Medical Association, is very supportive of us and they help fund us to go to these meetings. Like that's how we get to go to the AMA meetings. That's how we get to go to the CMA meetings. And they're really great at mentoring students. So I got to join it with that foray. And really once I got there, I was hooked. I found my tribe of people. It's incredible being surrounded by folks who are just so passionate, so knowledgeable, and you don't have to go into this space knowing much. Like I just kind of knew that like I'm interested in this stuff. I care about justice, but really what it all meant, I didn't know exactly what it was. And going there, just kind of learning and hearing all the things that people were talking about and all the resolutions that were being passed, the policies that they were caring about, I got to like learn by osmosis and kind of get to join in. So I'd say if you get the chance to go to these meetings, any of them, whether there be your county or the CMA state ones, the next ones are going to be in Los Angeles, definitely take a chance, go and like have some fun.
Absolutely. I love that idea of being naive, really, to a lot of the things, but just knowing you want to help. That's a great first step. Dr. Ramos, what was your first experience or memory of organized medicine?
My first experience was with the Latino Medical Student Association. So at the time, we had an active chapter at USC, and there was a statewide conference that was going to happen in Sacramento. So I had never been to Sacramento, and similar, to Sarah and to Anna, wanted to get a trip and have it paid for. And so what a wonderful opportunity to learn about health topics, about Latino health topics, and then do it on a paid training. And so that was my first experience. And the other three doctors that I went with were still very close friends. One's an ER doc, internal medicine, two are internal medicine, and one is ER. And we still talk about that trip, and we look back and we think, wow, it was so wonderful to had that experience, because it was not only a bonding experience for the students, but it was a leadership eye-opening experience for all of us. And so it really is, don't forget and don't be afraid to step up and stretch yourself and learn more about organized medicine, because the networks that you learn and you establish, it's amazing. It really expands you as a physician and opens your eyes to many things.
Something I love about your origin story is the idea that it started in med school. It doesn't have to start after you've gotten the degree. It can absolutely start now, regardless of your stage of training. Dr. Walker, I want to come to you because you also offered a definition for us in the chat, so I'd love to hear you touch on this. I also know, in knowing you personally, that you came into leadership relatively late in the game. And so tell me, what was your first foray with organized medicine? And I'd love for you to touch on this definition a bit more that you issued in the chat.
Sure, and of course, I hope I get to kind of go back around to my other panelists. And first and foremost, thank you for putting this panel together and giving us an opportunity to speak to this amazing group. The two of you, kudos. And I would say, similar, we were chatting right before we all came on, I didn't have something like this when I was a medical student. And to be honest, I had no real involvement. I mean, our student National Medical Association chapter was very active, but I actually wasn't a part of it. I mean, for me, medical school was, whew, how am I going to eat? It was just genuinely a difficult time. So I didn't really have that opportunity to like get involved in a lot of things. So many of these organizations and activities, you know, I saw my friends doing them, but I never really engaged. And I thought, you know, in particular, my career was really focused on, at the time, like hardcore like science and being in the lab and things like that. And so that was pretty much where I quote unquote lived and existed, and where I spent a lot of time going to like meetings and things of that nature. But I got to an opportunity to serve as president for the Association of Black Women Physicians. And as president, we had these connections to organizations in the community, but also something known as NEPO, the Network of Ethnic Physician Organizations, which had a foundational relationship with the California Medical Association. So through that, I got really involved, and they were like, hey, there's this thing called CMA and there are some opportunities. You should check it out. Like, really, you should go. And people made me feel welcome. People gave me an opportunity. And from there, it just kind of took off in ways that I couldn't have expected. But I will tell you, similarly, recognizing how much I didn't learn in medical school about health policy, that was a big impetus for me to go and pursue my master's of public health. Because I was like, I'm a doctor and people think I know this, but I don't. So my entry, you know, I often look at people who are what I kind of tease and call lifers, you know, like they've been in since they were medical students, they've been like serving on the AMA, like some of the amazing people on the call. And I'm like, I'm just still kind of figuring it out. But when I think about organized medicine, so much of society and the things that are right and wrong have to do with our health and our well-being. And so fundamentally, when we talk about equity, when we talk about wellness, we talk about the ability to people to truly pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Much of that is if you are well. And I've heard that you've learned a lot about like the history of the AMA and things of that nature. So one of the conversations we're having more and more is around gatekeeping and who gets to make the decisions, be it from a legal perspective, from a policy perspective, from a public health department perspective, from a who gets into medical school perspective. And so for me, getting involved in these organizations, I want to try to shift the voices, the perspectives, and change who the gatekeepers are. So that's how I kind of got involved and how I conceptualize organized medicine and why I stay involved.
So Anna, as a lifer, how would you define organized medicine? Because you've come into a couple of different organizational spaces and have even assumed leadership in a couple of different organizations. So how do you define organized medicine?
So I think Dr. Walker has probably the best and more official definition of what it truly is. But for me, what organized medicine means is that we can't get things done alone by ourselves. And we've been able to see other professions be so incredibly successful, nurses, if I'm going to point out one specifically, at getting their goals accomplished because they have such strong organized groups. And so for us, organized, and teachers as well, as Dr. Walker is pointing out, and unions as well. And this is coming from somebody who is in a resident union and has been working within the SEIU. They get stuff done. And it's because they realize the importance of banding together and speaking with a unified voice. And I think the problem with us as physicians is that, yes, we've had problematic past with these organized groups. AMA is one where, yes, they have a very separatist and problematic past that has resulted in other organizations that needed to pop up to serve the needs of, you know, minority physicians. But that's also resulted, unfortunately, in us not necessarily being as effective and having a lot of infighting within us as physicians on who we join and where we put our loyalties to. At the end of the day, I recognize that like the American Medical Association, our state medical associations, and to an extent our specialty medical associations, they're going to have a lot of strength in the particular spheres that they inhabit. But when we're looking at medicine on a federal level and medicine on a state level, politicians are going to be looking at these groups, specifically the American Medical Association or the California Medical Association, and seeing what their stance is on these policies in order to figure out what doctors want, whether for good or for bad. They're not going to necessarily listen to individual physicians as they will as a big group. And so where I see us all fitting in organized medicine is these groups, ultimately our policy positions, what we do, what we say is driven by simple folks just like us, just physicians who have decided to join and be a part of these organizations. And we have the chance to really change policy and to really make what these organized groups decide to take a stance on. And we can talk about like some examples later on the call, but things that we even have done as medical students, I've worked with Sarah on, we've been able to change the stance of such a large group like the American Medical Association. And that's kind of what I see as the big draw in being a part of these organized medicine groups, is just our voices are so much more and larger amplified in these groups.
Absolutely. And so I love the corny phrase, but real phrase in terms of organized medicine, that we get to be the change we want to see in the world, right? That we get to actualize the change we want to see in the world. I want to come to what some of that specific action has looked like, because we're hearing this kind of meta idea of the impact you can have, but not necessarily what that means. So I want to hone in, and I want to come to you, Sarah Mae, because you've been really involved in specific initiatives, specifically within the medical student section. First, I want you to define what a section of the AMA is, because people might not necessarily understand what that means. And then I'm going to open the floor for the question to all of our panelists about what you've managed to do within your individual organization. So if you can just start there and define for us what the medical student section is, or what sections of the AMA are, and then we can hone into what you've been actually able to do as a member of that section.
Sure. So a section is an entity within the larger organized medicine context that represents the viewpoint of some group of individuals within organized medicine. So there's the medical student section, which every AMA member who is a medical student is by default a member of the medical student section, and I've been in leadership there. Anna is in leadership in the resident and fellow section. There's also sections like the women physician section, and I know that Dr. Ramos has been in leadership there, the minority affairs section, young physician section, as well as senior physician section. So all of these groups have different interests and priorities, and the sections serve as an entity within organized medicine for them to make their views heard. And typically each of these sections has its own democratic process for determining both their leadership as well as their policy priorities by dint of resolutions to bring forward within the larger entities of the American Medical Association and the California Medical Association. In terms of issues that I've seen come to fruition during my time in the medical student section, so having the CMA take a strong and the AMA take a strong position on housing affordability and homelessness was a major passion of mine, and we had housing affordability and homelessness as a major issue at the past California Medical Association House of Delegates. And then I know that Dr. Walker can speak to this as our chair of council legislation, but you really see that reflected in the CMA supporting major housing legislation like AB 15 and AB 16 in the current legislative cycle. Those are major initiatives that would meaningfully address housing affordability and try to ameliorate homelessness. I think about other issues like supervised injections facilities, which was really driven by the medical student section. Things that I'm really excited to have worked on in the recent past that I hope to see come to fruition in the near future are things around long-term supports and services, and specifically I've worked on reports in both the AMA and the CMA to support a public catastrophic long-term care insurance program, which I think is critical to addressing this issue that is so often forgotten. So I think those are some of the things that I've been passionate to work about in the MSS, but really you could come up with infinite examples, and I'm sure
We all
Other
have them.
panelists will speak to that.
I have a couple other great examples. In the medical student section, I think in the 90s or 80s, whenever this came about, they realized that smoking was bad on planes. And so wrote a resolution in the medical student section that went all the way up through the AMA. They authored the bill on banning smoking on planes. And that's like a perfect example of one. More recently, also, we've had in the CMA, with us being able to actually have physician aid in dying in California was really because of the medical student section of the CMA. The medical students came together and decided, hey, you know, we think that physicians are pretty split on this and that we shouldn't have a unified no on this stance, and instead push the CMA to be neutral, which ultimately allowed California to go through and allow the people to decide if physician aid in dying was something that they wanted to have in California, and now we do. Because historically, CMA was very much against it and had a unified stance against it, which would always avoid it from being passed. And that was directly because medical students came together and said, you know what, like, let's think about this again. I'd say with this whole, the resolution process and all this stuff is many hands make light work. And that's kind of part of the beauty also in organized medicine, is that you can have an idea and may not know how to make it happen or really how to make it come to fruition. But working with other individuals who have worked on resolutions before, or have worked in policy in your organized medicine groups before, coming together and working on these together can make you have a bigger impact than you ever imagined. While in the medical student section, had some friends come together and say, hey, we want to try to reverse the AMA stance on single payer and maybe have us at least be neutral or think about it. And our resolution came to a vote finally in the AMA, I think 2 years ago or so, when we still had in-person meetings. And it came to being very closely passed, like what I think it was like a 5-point or 6-point spread, which came out in the news because historically the AMA has been very, very, very anti-single payer or unified healthcare system. And so it's all about seeing us move the needle slowly. And I know maybe the next time we bring another resolution like that forward, we might get a different outcome. But it's been great to see those changes there.
And it's about continuing the fight, right? The idea here in terms of introducing a resolution within your given section, and this is unique to the American Medical Association, State Medical Association, County Medical Association structure. And don't worry, Dr. Ramos, I'm going to come to you around specialty organizations in just a bit. It's this idea that you recognize a problem. This is exactly what we talked about in our physician advocacy session earlier today. And then that you want to minimize that delay between when a GERD person recognizes a problem and when they decide to act upon it. And that delay can be a process of the legislative process within the organization, but it could also mean, I don't know what to do with this energy. Well, you can funnel that energy into organized medicine. Dr. Walker, I do want to ask you a question about that actual process. If someone introduces a resolution, which you really purely defined in the chat, what happens next?
So I'm going to not completely answer that question, and I'm going to take a little liberty, and because I do think I'd love to hear from Dr. Ramos, and instead of answering exactly what happens next, I'd really love to answer, like in my role as chair of COL, what it means when we're like making decisions on supporting legislation. And I think that'll partially answer your question. Is that okay?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so I'll punt to Dr. Ramos.
So basically, once you have an idea, you write it up, and it's called the resolution. The resolution, you have to, depending upon which body you're submitting it through. So if you're submitting it through the American Medical Association, then you have to present it and write it in a specific format. Sometimes folks don't know how to do that. And so the AMA has been fantastic in terms of providing the resources. The other thing that happens is that it is even more powerful if this idea, whatever it is that you're wanting to implement, comes from your delegation. So I am the chair for the American College of OBGYN delegation to the American Medical Association. So we have 14 delegates on our delegation. The total number of delegates in the AMA is somewhere around 400, I believe. I don't know the exact numbers. So, you've got a whole body of physicians saying this is what we want to put forward. You try to get, it's very much similar to politics, you try to get supporters to speak on behalf of this idea. There may be some advocates or people that you speak with that want to modify what you have written. And so that's where modifications come into play. And the final outcome, once you have your quote unquote resolution completed at the American Medical Association, what happens is that there is a reference committee. It's similar to a hearing. And so the idea is presented, assuming that it hasn't been, I'm just going to keep it simple. So then it's, because a lot of other things can happen before it could even get to that point. But assuming that it is now reviewed as a wider body for by those attending that reference committee, you're going to get support or no support. And then there's a committee that is going to write up the recommendation as to what should happen to your resolution. And then that gets presented to the entire, eventually to the entire House of Medicine. So all the 400 plus delegates then get to see it. And if the reference committee says, okay, we move to adopt or to modify or to refer it to the board for study or whatever, sometimes there is debate, what's called debate. Basically, it's discussion. So it is similar to laws, the way that laws are passed, but it's on a smaller scale. It's an amazing experience. If any of you ever have a chance to go to the American Medical Association meetings, you are in a room, literally there's about 700 doctors. And for any doc that says, well, the AMA is not me, every single specialty is pretty much represented in that ballroom. And the decisions that come out of the American Medical Association really are the voice of the largest policy advocacy group of physicians, which is the American Medical Association. So I know it's not so easy. It's like making laws. You know, it's like sausage being made. You don't want to hear all of how you make the sausage, but it really is a lot of negotiating and politicking in the background.
Yep. And if you're interested in getting involved in that process, these are absolutely the people to ask, and I'd be happy to connect you with any of them. Dr. Walker, we can come to you next about what that means for you in the council and legislation, and when you are introduced with these ideas, right? These resolutions, how you leverage your position or positionality within the larger organization to make sense of those ideas.
So so this is what I really wanted to touch on, because you would think in 2021, how could there still be policy that we don't have and that we don't need, that should be able to guide the way we practice? I mean, we figured out looking on planes is not a good idea. But when it comes to, and this is what happens both at the AMA and I'm going to focus on local for us in California, every year, Sacramento turns out a bunch of proposed bills and legislation, often in the thousands. As a lobbying organization, we have staff that goes through all of that legislation and says, hey, these are things that would affect the House of Medicine, that we should take a position on, that we should take a stand on. And sometimes they're good ideas, and sometimes they're things we're like, oh my gosh, we cannot let that happen. But part of how CMA has to operate is they have to do it based on the existing policy, because we have to be able to provide a rationale for why we're taking a position, right? So similar, when you hear about lawyers in the Supreme Court, there's this idea of precedent, even though I'm really troubled by the recent decision today that basically, maybe we'll get to that, juvenile life without parole, that they just ignored precedent and decided to come up with something altogether new. I'm going to come back to that for a reason. Because we look at the policy that exists, and based off of that, we use that to determine A, what we can weigh in on, and B, how we weigh in on that issue. And so traditionally, as Anna mentioned, there wasn't really support for the idea of like universal health coverage or single payer, those types of concepts. In fact, physicians and the AMA historically have been adamantly opposed. But then there are even things like violence, social determinants of health, incarceration, food insecurity, housing insecurity. Environmental justice, climate change. We know these have direct health effects, but if I don't have CMA policy that I can write a rationale, even if I know we should take a position on it, and sometimes we're literally trying to like string together policy from a resolution that was written in 1979, and bringing it forward. And I've gotten to the point now that I actually have like a running tally of like, when I have time, I'm going to try to work with people to write more resolutions to fill in these huge gaps that we still have. Resolutions are also a way to educate our membership, because there are things that you're learning now in medical school that people who were practicing or who finished medical school 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, never learned. And similar to how our society is continuing to evolve, without that context, without that discussion, you don't really move, quote unquote, the house of medicine forward. So I just wanted to, oftentimes you feel like I'm not really doing anything, I'm not really making a difference. There are so many ways to advocate. There are so many ways to be an activist. And particularly as we talked about, when you're trying to influence the respected profession of medicine, doing this type of work may not be glamorous, but it is essential.
Absolutely. What a sermon. I want us to understand that the AMA, CMA, whatever state you might exist in, pathway is just one way in which you can bring your energy, your ideas to become policy, to either guide clinical practice or influence state or federal legislature, etc. There are also specialty organizations where you might find a little bit more community in, because it's very focused on your profession. I know we're joined by family medicine residents today, and so I want to come to you, Dr. Ramos, and then to you, Dr. Yap, to talk about what all of this looks like in terms of having an idea, bringing that to fruition in some sort of policy writing or advocacy space in a specialty organization. So I want to start with you, Dr. Ramos, and ACOG.
Yeah, so again, going back to what Valencia said earlier, once you have an idea or something that is impacting your field or your profession, specifically for the AMA, you want to have that support. Many times what we're hearing from some of our delegates when we're trying to introduce some resolutions, we hear, well, that has nothing to do with me as a doctor. What does that have to do with practicing medicine? Well, it has to do a lot. And one example that I'll give is a resolution that we wrote a few years ago having to do with marijuana. And with marijuana, one of the recommendations that we came out with that turned into a resolution, so maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, marijuana was not legal, cannabis was not legal. And so what we wanted and the resolution eventually passed was to have some kind of notification wherever there is vending of CBD ingredient, whatever it is, because now there's many forms, to say that during pregnancy, there potentially could be harm during pregnancy, similar to what you see with cigarettes. And so one of the gynecologists on our team said, well, wait a minute, again, what does that have to do with what we're doing? But what ended up happening, it ended up getting passed through the House of Medicine, because then we started to hear, then we got the support from family practice, we got the support from pediatrics, we got the support from internal medicine saying, you know what, we're seeing that the negative effects of these of using cannabis during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And so again, it just impacts a lot. So once it made national news, once USA Today was putting it on their news feed, AP was putting it on their news feed, when it comes time to writing legislation, it is so powerful to have the AMA's policy statement say, this is something that the AMA stands by. And they use that, they meaning the people who are wanting to now make a law or pass a law, use what the AMA provides as policy for their background information to say, this is why we have to do it. If our doctors are saying XYZ, whatever the issue is, we need to support it. So whatever your specialty will end up being, sometimes folks think that, well, you know, this only impacts me, it only impacts my profession. In reality, once you start to talk about it, once you start to see the data and the ripple effect, you realize, wow, we are all impacted by this. And this is something that really we as a House of Medicine, as the AMA, need to stand up and come together to say this is important for us as physicians.
Sure. So the idea that an idea that's unique to your specialty can start within a specialty organization, can still make its way through the AMA if it needs to, but that some of the most trusted voices around a certain issue might not necessarily be the entire body of the American Medical Association. Especially if we're talking about pregnancy. I'm gonna Google ACOG's recommendation first before I look at AMA's policy, right? If I'm trying to think about evidence-based practice guidelines, I'm gonna look at ACOG's recommendation first before I see if there's some obscure policy recommendation that might guide my practice, right? So I want us to understand the power of specialty organizations in developing policy too, that while it doesn't seem as, you know, clean cut around this is our political process and this is how we leverage it in the lobbying, you know, practices within an organization, just know that that can actually guide a lot of other discussion past the specialty organization, right? I want to understand your perspective of that too, Anna, in emergency, how being a voice or a change agent within a specialty organization can be just as impactful, if not more so, than just existing within the AMA, CMA, et cetera.
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, when, for example, the California Academy of College Physicians, I'm involved in our California ASAP, when bills that are regarding emergency services come up, they're a little bit more niche and they're not all of medicine. Like the politicians are going to come or be like, what are the emergency physicians' opinion on this? And so that's kind of where our specialty associations fit that role, is they very much many times our state or national associations will defer to specialty associations saying, well, this is a topic that affects specifically this part of medicine, and we will defer to their opinion on this topic. And so a lot of times actually in specialty associations, it's even easier to get in because there's like less folks involved. And a lot of times the people that you work with are going to be the people in those specialty associations as well. And so you make a lot of those relationships who, as a medical student, is particularly invaluable because these individuals who you're going to make friends with in these specialty associations are going to be the ones who can help you get jobs and help you move forward in your particular specialty. The other thing that I want to kind of bring also to all of this is, yes, we're talking about our specialty in our state and national associations as organized medicine, but there's also other things that are kind of like organized medicine adjacent. So for me, I'm particularly involved in the Committee of Interns and Residents, which is the largest resident union in America. And I, because of all my experience in organized medicine, have actually been helping them to develop their policy arm. And I helped author a bill was brought to California legislature last year and is going back to legislation this year. And I've been learning a lot in that process in terms of like working with authors and talking to politicians about how we can get this bill forward, and really working with the union and our staffers to come up with what the best solutions are. And in this whole process, and what's made it very clear is, like, we as doctors, we're really busy. And in our specialty organizations, in our organized medicine groups, we see that a lot of times medical students actually have the most resolutions put forward, and oftentimes the best well-researched resolutions, because by pure fact of the time we have and the energy that we have. But the further on we go in our careers, we don't necessarily have that much time and energy, but that's where our staffers come in, and our staffers are invaluable because in these organizations that we're in, they're going to be the ones who actually put our ideas, our resolutions forward into reality, whether they be our lobbyists, whether they be the people who actually write the official things that come out of our resolutions, or they're the ones who come up with public service campaigns and help like execute them. And so whenever you're in these groups, also making sure that you do your best to become friends with your staffers is going to be really essential to making sure that like what you want to make happen also comes forward. Because a lot of times, well, actually all the time, they're the ones who are also writing reviews of the resolutions that come forward, bringing in more information and more background. And a lot of times the things that they write can also help influence the other physicians on what their final stance on policies are going to be when we're coming to a vote or coming to a decision on what to make or what decision to make. I'm sorry, I've been working a lot, so sometimes
I'm
my
with
words
you.
don't make sense.
We're here. We're here, Hannah. We're here. So I really want to sit with one of the points you made around how progressive you have the opportunity to be in these organizations. One of the points that has been made a couple times here and outside of this session is how regressive organized medicine has been in the past. I want to come to you, Sarah Mae, to ask the question around kind of your perspective on this. The criticism that organized medicine is a bunch of stuffy old white men who are out of touch, who are really just trying to access power. They don't represent me. What does me as a 27-year-old Black girl have anything to do in an AMA, right? Especially understanding its racist legacy. I want to come to you because you've occupied leadership in this space and you've had to interact with some of the crotchety folks that we think occupy the majority in these organizations. What is your general perspective? Is some of my myths or beliefs true, or are they subtly being debunked in your experience? Is the Medical Student Association, our medical student section, the rule or the exception?
So I think it's a very fair question. I think hopefully the voices and faces that you see reflected here indicate that it's not all old white men, but certainly historically, and then even in present day, there are a lot of older white men in power. I think, so one, I have a ton of respect and love for folks who work to pressure the organizations from without. I'm an institutionalist. I try to change from within. But I think both approaches are very necessary and very impactful. As I had said previously, they are both the California Medical Association as well as the American Medical Association are democratic organizations where different entities elect their delegates to ultimately vote up and down on policy. And there certainly needs to be more done to ensure that those votes and delegates are reflecting the practice of medicine and aren't just vestiges of a less diverse, more discriminatory time. And I think that the medical student section and hopefully the work that we've been able to do in the recent past and leading in the present and leading into the future is improving the organization and making it more reflective of both the physician populace as well as our patients. Some of the issues that we've talked about, and especially around improving access to care, drug pricing, some of the more social determinants of health issues are things that are issues that the medical students, the residents and fellows, some of the more historically marginalized and minoritized voices that are being brought into the organizations are elevating and forcing the organizations to have a conversation about. I think a great example of this is the discussions that the medical student section brought at the past American Medical Association meeting around racism as a public health crisis, around race as a social construct and denouncing racial essentialism in medicine, and around police brutality as a public health issue, and having meaningful change around, for example, use of force standards, so that we're not just naming the issue, but we're actually proposing solutions. So I think, again, I think it's a fair question. I think we need all perspectives, and I think the more that folks with progressive perspectives join into the organizations and take leadership roles and ultimately represent the ideas that they'd like to see changed, that will continue to make more progress.
Beautifully put. And I agree.
I
was egging you on.
Well, actually, I want to chime in on this because I do think it's a fair question and it's an important question. But let's put a little bit of reality to this. Let's look at all the presidents that we've had of the United States. Not a single woman, one Black man. When we look at our Congress 2020, let's talk about gender. So not even 25% of our Congress are women. And then if you look at that, even fewer are women of color. When you look at owners of major sports franchises, when you look at CEOs of corporations, fundamentally, we live in a society that has been unmistakably shaped by structural racism, both institutionalized and systemic. So as we do this work, and as we recognize the change that needs to happen, we are hopefully in a watershed historic moment, in our lifetime, where we get to be a part of that idea, the change that we want to see, that we recognize the urgency, we recognize that it's critical, but we recognize we're doing something that our systems are not set up to allow. And so we truly are trying to make change. We can accept things as they are and say that's the way it's always going to be. But I will tell you, there's this amazing quote from James Baldwin. I admire people like James Baldwin and Audre Lorde and, Bayard Rustin. But James Baldwin says that, nothing can be changed if we don't face it. So the only thing I know for sure is that it will stay old white men if I do nothing about it. But if I make an effort, if I bring other people along, if I believe in the difference that we can make, that's where the possibility for change happens, and it can look differently. We don't do it because it's like, oh, like I'm tired of hearing like, this is the first woman of color, this is the first. Like, I want to really make changes that are sustainable and that we create a new normal. And so I hope part of the reason why you're here, you're listening to us, is that that's something that resonates with you. We know what history has always shown us. We know the way that opportunities were structured to advantage or disadvantage others. When we think about the definition from Dr. Kamara Jones on structural racism. But this is an amazing moment, again, to change the gatekeepers, to normalize equity, to really bring about justice, to bring about respect and dignity and belonging for every single person in our society.
Absolutely. And I've been able to find community, I think, in any space within medicine as a profession. You definitely have to find your niche, right? You have to find your community and you have to find your like-minded individuals, build coalition with them, and then appease the other people on the other side of the aisle, if you will, in order to really effectuate change. And I think it's necessary to understand how beautiful of an opportunity we all have to leverage organized medicine as a tool. I want to come back to that idea.
Sorry, if I can just
chime in, please do.
Yes, if I can just make a quick comment. So yes, the AMA, and just like many other medical professional societies, have primarily been older white men, but it's all starting to change. And we can see that now in the AMA, we can see it in the presidents. There are 3 female presidents in a row. Dr. Patrice Harris is an African-American. She was the immediate past president. Right now we have Dr. Sue Bailey, who is the current president. So we have 3 female presidents. It's starting to change. And one thing I encourage medical students to do is to be involved. Don't just sit there and complain and think, why can't they do this? Well, why can't they? Well, why don't we do this? And start to be part of what needs to happen. And then that's how we're going to start seeing the changes. You can see it with my colleagues here on this panel, is that the changes are happening because we are choosing to do something about making those changes happen. So I would challenge all of you, step up, who are attending the class, step up and really be part of that change.
Absolutely. And I want to make sure our audience knows that you can ask questions too. I am sucking up a lot of the air and asking questions right now. So please do ask them, either DM me personally or drop any questions in the chat. You started to answer what I was going to ask next, Dr. Ramos, and it's this idea about what might frustrate you in this process. We heard a lot about what you're able to do, what you have done, the opportunity that you have, but I want to understand some of the frustrations because I want to paint a very realistic picture about what it means to be a part of a professional organization. It's not always sunshine and rainbows, and I want to be blunt and specific about that point, because part of this elective has been not just outlining possibilities in terms of solutions, but also making sure we understand the issues at hand, things that are going wrong in our system in order to be effective advocates, right? To your point, Dr. Walker, in the chat, you don't have to be an institutionalist, but you should understand how institutions function, right? So I actually do want to come back to you, Dr. Ramos, especially because you've occupied leadership in a couple different organizations. What might frustrate you about your involvement, or what are some growth edges that you perceived in your involvement in professional societies?
I think sometimes, going to what Valencia said earlier, you are the first of. So having been the first Hispanic president of the Orange County Medical Association, it was completely different, and having to make sure that you are heard. And I think one of the biggest challenges is really trying to get folks on board and listening to you. A lot of it has to do with the microaggressions. And I think we here on the panel, we have a double microaggression. We're female. We're female, and if we're of color, then it's a double whammy. And just wanting to be heard and listened because of our what we're saying and our ideas is sometimes challenging. When I say something, make a comment, and it's not really acknowledged, and the person sitting next to me says the same thing, and they get acknowledged because it's a man, I'm thinking, okay, what do I have to do? And it's a matter of saying, hey, wait a minute, I just said that, and pointing out, I just said that, and I say it, could I have said this different so that you could understand what was just repeated? I really want to learn. And just standing up and not being afraid to speak up for ourselves. I think that has oftentimes been a challenge. But when you are uncomfortable and when you feel challenged, guess what? That's when you're growing. And don't be afraid of those opportunities for growth.
Yeah, and we heard in Chase Anderson's talk last night around how identity formation really does influences your ability to advocate. I argue that you cannot be an effective advocate unless you know who you are. And I think you're being a woman of color, a Hispanic woman in a space where, in a county that is hugely Hispanic, hugely Latinx, and may not have had that representation within the Orange County Medical Association, you occupied a really unique and powerful position in being that, even if it came with some challenges. I want to open the floor for anyone that wants to answer this question before I come into my last one around what some of the frustrations might be. If anyone does have additions or anything they want to chime in here, I welcome it.
I think compromise is always hard, and it's a necessary component of discussions in organized medicine. There are a variety of perspectives represented, and because they are democratic organizations, I don't think the views of the American Medical Association nor the California Medical Association, there's probably not a single physician who agrees with every piece of policy in either policy compendium. And certainly there have been ideas that I have brought or that have supported other folks in bringing to these organizations that through the amendment process that Dr. Ramos spoke about, or due to opposition from other groups within the organization, the final outcome is not what I would have liked to have seen. And I think it also can be specifically frustrating when you're having some of these conversations behind closed doors. So when you're on some of these entities like the Board of Trustees or some of the councils, you are one of a small group of folks who are discussing and coming up with the recommendations on various policy issues. And then once the group has decided, once a consensus has been established, you're tasked with explaining those recommendations to the rest of the organization and why you came down where you came down. And something that I think is appropriately uncomfortable is when I have represented a different perspective in the room, we've come to a compromise that doesn't necessarily exactly reflect my viewpoint, but then I need to explain that to the broader medical student section or other folks who maybe share my perspective, but weren't in the room. And I think, speaking again, that like the pressure from outside is really helpful in pushing these entities to get to where we want to go. But it's still tough when you are the individual in the position trying to represent those ideas. And I think that it's a constant reevaluation of whether you're doing more good within as a voice in that room, one of the few voices in that the halls of power, so to speak, and whether you're doing more good there, trying to collaborate, work with others, develop relationships in order to push forward your values versus pressing from outside.
Sure. And I don't want to make the point that we only develop skills after encountering trauma or negativity, but I think in both of these stories, there were really important skills learned. First is understanding how to make your viewpoint more readily accessible or digestible by the seemingly opposition or majority, which is something you're going to have to continue to do no matter who you are in a political or advocacy space in Dr. Ramos's story. And then in Sarah Mae's, it's the idea of trying to find consensus and build consensus with people that may not share the same ideals that you do. That's going to be a thing. If you call yourself an advocate, or if you hope to be, you're going to interact with people who do not share the same viewpoints as you do. And if you're not, that's a problem. So I think it's a really good point that you made here, Sarah Mae, the idea that you had to find middle ground, and that skill was able to be developed because of your experience in occupying leadership and membership within organized medical spaces. I want to close this on a positive note, though. I want us to end feeling warm and fuzzy. So I want us to leave with your fondest memory in an organized medical space. What is the one thing where you're like, oh man, we got that done. That was good. I did something. That felt right. I achieved something. What was that moment for you? I see some thinking faces, so I actually want to just offer whoever wants to speak first instead of putting anyone on the spot first. Does anyone have any thoughts?
I'll go first since it was actually a pretty big deal. I was the chair of the Minority Affairs section for the AMA, and this is a group that has representatives from NMA and NHMA, American Indian Society, and the two at-large physicians. So we at the AMA had worked, it was 2-3 years to try to get a vote. We wanted a vote. We didn't want to just be an advisory group to the board of the AMA. We wanted to actually vote. And we were able to get that vote as a minority affairs section. And that was a huge win because now we were not only at the table, but we actually had the voice of voting.
Love a good feel good, right? It's being able to bring, because everyone has a voice. It's just a matter of if you can amplify that voice to a point that Dr. Walker made earlier. So all of these different organizations that you represent, the NHMA, the NMA, etc., all had a voice. They all had a standpoint, right? But you finally had the ability to amplify that voice, and that's really powerful, especially in thinking about a story where you told where your voice might have been silenced in the past. Absolutely. Dr.
So I'll jump in. I was gonna say I'll jump in next. One is probably not as big, but I felt really good about it. And Dr. Yap and I worked with another physician on a resolution around workforce. And we started at the CMA, we referred it to national action at the AMA, and it went all the way through at the AMA. And you don't often think of something that you start at a very local level, working its way through that process. And it was my first time having that type of experience. And it was pretty awesome to work with someone who was so experienced as Dr. Yap, who I think was a medical student at the time. So for me, what I appreciate about this space is, yes, people often have very different viewpoints and perspectives than mine, but I feel like I can learn from anyone, regardless of where they are, quote unquote, in the hierarchy of medicine. And so that's been really phenomenal to have like these relationships with medical students and residents, even though I'm like an old lady. The other small thing is a bit bittersweet. And I know we're supposed to be warm and fuzzy, but the CMA has not always had the best track record when it comes to advocating for Black women and Black maternal mortality. And they were attempting to do a program that basically had no Black women represented on the issue of Black maternal mortality. And they wanted me to be like the moderator. And I was like, no, like what you're not going to do is put my face on this, because you must do better. And it was tense, you know, I really had to fight and push for it. And fortunately, Kelly McHugh, who is my vice chair of COL, and is also OBGYN and very active in ACOG, like totally had my back. And it was really, amazing. And we kind of put the CMA on notice, like, hey, as long as you're stuck with the two of us as chair and vice chair, you have to do better. Are we where CMA should be and needs to be? No, but even in that little moment, I was glad I was able to be a voice in the room to say we should do it differently.
I love that you pointed out, because I don't want you to trivialize that moment, that it might not be as big as you phrased it, because it was big, that was big, because you managed to change hearts and minds around an issue in that example and in that story. And then the resolution writing process, the idea that you get to flatten the hierarchy a bit. I've worked with people who are quite literally 30 years my senior and have been on text basis, right? Dr. C. Freeman is one of the people that I could certainly call upon in a lot of organized medical spaces, who was my place in medicine when I was born. And we get to just chat about issues, right? In ways that I don't know that we can in clinical environments. So I appreciate that story because it's meaningful and you matter. If anyone wants to go next in terms of offering a meaningful story.
I know Sarah unmuted herself, so
Yeah.
you should go. I can finish up too.
Okay. I was the chair of the medical student section caucus in the American Medical Association for the 2016 to 2017 term, which obviously includes the 2016 election, which occurred on a Tuesday. And the meeting that year was that following Thursday. And I think for a lot of medical students coming together in the aftermath of that election, that there was a lot of collective trauma and uncertainty that we were working through, and helping to champion. A group of students wrote a resolution around supporting DACA students as well as DACA, everyone with DACA. And basically this group of students stayed up all night writing the resolution in order to get it considered at that Thursday meeting. And ended up being something that the medical student section came behind and championed. And I had the privilege of championing within the House of Delegates. Because of the time frame, there were some procedural barriers to trying to get it considered that we had to work through. So it was a sort of a difficult parliamentary finagling, but we ultimately were able to work to secure support for the DACA program and support our DACA medical students, residents, and fellows and patients. And from there going forward, I think at the time it was a big challenge to demonstrate and convince the entire House of Medicine that immigration issues like DACA were within the scope of organized medicine in the AMA. But moving forward, I've had the privilege to really work on issues like improving conditions in immigrant detention centers. A group of students from UCI actually wrote a resolution around opposing the Office of Refugee Resettlement's use of medical and psychological records, which the AMA has incorporated both in advocacy around legislation as well as some of the court cases that have come up around this. And so really seeing immigration go from being something that was perceived as being outside the purview of the AMA to championing a resolution that had tangible impacts for some of our medical students, residents, and fellows, and certainly physicians, and then seeing immigration increasingly being a more central component of AMA advocacy has been something that I'm I've been really proud of. And then I guess also on a personal note, I've met a lot of my best friends through organized medicine. I know that serving as bridesmaid at a wedding that I know Anna also attended, I actually met my partner through organized medicine. So I think being surrounded by folks who are equally passionate, share values, and come together for these very intense meeting times in order to make policy and enact change, I think that really forms really strong bonds that I'll have for the rest of my career. So on a personal note, I'd also note that.
I love that, Sarah Mae. And the idea that Dr. Walker was speaking about earlier, that health is everything and everything is health. You made that a reality instead of just an idea. I think that's really powerful. I too found some of my closest friends through the Student National Medical Association, and I share that sentiment around how shared struggle, shared ideology, and shared passion can really bring people together. So if you are one person who is struggling to find community at your medical school, undergraduate institution, know that you can possibly find that in organized medicine, absolutely. And you might find you a partner too, hey. I wanna come to you, Dr. Yap, to close this out with a fond memory or story when it comes to organized medicine.
So I'm glad that Sarah pointed out Dr. One, because I was going to also possibly bring it up, but she was much more eloquent than I. But I think in all of this, there's just been all of these like late night talks about policy things we've really cared about, that we've come together and written resolutions. It's like literally 2 a.m. to like put it together and send it forward. I think one of the ones I want to bring up is around the time when Trump was initially elected and he wanted to put forward the AHCA, the American Healthcare Something Act, that was supposed to try to replace the ACA and was a terrible replacement. He had announced this, I think sometime around when our meeting was. And so me and some friends put together a resolution, literally, I think at 2 a.m., half of us were drunk. And we wrote this resolution to basically be like, AMA, you need to condemn this. And we submitted it at like the 9th hour or whatever, 23rd hour. I don't actually know how idiom goes because English ain't my first language. And we put it forward and got it past the House. And it was such a, and the AMA shortly came out afterwards and was like, nope, this is not going to work. And we ended up on the Hill very much fighting the HCA and saying that that's just not a good idea. Did the AMA need us to write that resolution? Maybe, maybe not, but it definitely helped us feel like it made us as an organization be very active and vocal about it. Because it came around at a time when AMA also supported somebody who many of us weren't fond of, and there was like question mark about how we were going to go about in the political sphere when Trump came to power. And all that is a story just to say, I love my friends at the AMA. I think Dr. Ramos brings it up really well where, and I think you too, Kelly, where I get to be friends with physicians who in like a quasi-professional manner, in so much as we talk about medicine, but also we get to be friends, and I also get to like change their minds. And I think they respect me more than I feel like I would ever be respected in like doing this medicine sphere. As just a medical student and now as a resident. And it's been an experience which has really helped to solidify my own comfort and my own confidence when it comes to being a physician in the sphere, when it comes to knowing how much power I can actually change and have. And it's why I love mentoring medical students too, because I tell y'all, you as a medical student have so much power still and can do so much to help change the world still. And while we're still learning about this general medicine and how to practice, but we have a lot to say when it comes to these other matters and how it can affect medicine, and helping to change minds that might say, yeah, this should be outside of our lane, but realistically, this is in our lane. Gun violence is in our lane. Immigrant matters are in our lane. All these things are in our lane. And I think we, as a younger generation who's entering medicine, have so much to bring to the table. We're coming into medicine with such a larger diversity in ideals and reasons why we're entering medicine, because medicine is no longer just a profession where you can enter and make good money and peace out. Like it doesn't really work that way anymore. Our workforce is changing, the way medicine is practicing and administered in America is changing. And we have a lot of expertise in these areas that affect us so dearly, and that is going to affect our practice in the future so dearly. So it's so important for all of us to infiltrate these spaces that have been traditionally older and white, right? Because our workforce is changing, who's entering medicine is changing, and therefore we need to enter those spaces too, to make sure it reflects us and what we believe in.
I love the idea that raw emotion could be actionable for you. Because something I've certainly struggled with as an activist is, I can't afford to get arrested in the streets marching, right? I can't afford to. I got a residency to start in June, right? So I love the idea that you were able to channel some of that raw emotion in the face of some sort of political decision, in this case, an election, in this case, a bill that was introduced, or a policy priority that was introduced, and got to make that actionable. I also love the idea about power being bottom up instead of top to bottom, especially in these spaces where are not spaces, the space that is medicine that is deeply hierarchical. I love that you have been able to find agency and power and opportunity in this space. For those who are with us today as panelists, to Dr. Valencia Walker, Dr. Anna Yap, Dr. Diana Ramos, and Sarah Mae Smith, future Dr. Sarah Mae Smith. Well, actually, did you defend yet? Are you a doctor yet? Okay, almost, soon to be Dr. Sarah Mae Smith. I want to thank you for offering your vulnerability, your time, your stories, and your expertise to this panel. I think people are walking away with a much clearer idea of what organized medicine is, what it can look like, right? And how you can get involved. If people were confused or missed some of the links that were dropped, they're actually a part of our syllabus. It's not a secret, it's public information, and I'll drop the link in the chat in now. And I want to encourage you all to give us feedback. Let us know what was great about this session. Last year, it was a session just about what is organized medicine, and there was feedback to say we want to hear from providers. And this year is a panel. So we really do take that feedback and make it a reality for this elective to come. So thank you to our panelists for being a part of this discussion. I do want to mention that if you are staying on with us in the general elective, that we will actually have a session specifically around lobbying as a practice coming up at 6 p.m. this evening. We're welcomed by Janice Norman, who is on staff for the California Medical Association, to talk about what lobbying is. It's a really nice ease into or from our discussion around advocacy this morning, organized medicine. Ooh, hello, I'm excited, apparently. Organized medicine this afternoon, and then into what lobbying actually is. So you're gonna leave with a really awesome skill and definition around what lobbying is this evening. We encourage you to join us at 6 p.m. It's the same link for people that are interested. For people that are new to this space, we also wanna make sure that we gather your feedback. So just know that that all happens through the same poll everywhere link that's been dropped in the chat by Reed.